properties of these kinds of linkograph that allow you to isolate different ways in which creativity might take place. Let's go with this. So, what he's been doing then is doing detailed ethnographic observations of design processes, setting designers, architects, small design tasks, filming them and observing what they're doing and talking to them, trying to understand the processes. He's then tried to build that together as a qualitative understanding of the design process, but also through the use of the linkograph to develop a quantitative way of beginning to measure this. He's particularly interested, as I said, in these particular creative events. So, one hypothesis in this is that there will be drastic changes and paradigm shifts in the design, which will be associated with particular points or episodes in the creative process. And the creative process in this case is to do with the way that people are externalizing the ideas in their head onto the sketch on a piece of paper. So, he's looking for aha moments. This is why I'm apologising for this presentation. He's looking for these aha moments, and he's looking in particular using the linkograph as both an underdirected graph, in which you can think of episodes being related to previous ones and to future ones in an undifferentiated way, or to look at linkographs as being directed graphs in which you only have the past series of episodes. So it's the comparison between a directed and undirected graph is the methodology that he's been developing here, which is really what this paper is about. I think I'm going to skip this. It's about Eureka and Cursor, yeah? Okay. So, a linkograph representation, for those who don't understand it, I've come across it before, has a series of episodes, tick, 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 and these are linked. So, if this episode is unrelated to the second thing the person did, and unrelated to the third thing the person did, but actually it's related back to the fifth. Yeah, so it appears as a node in the graph like that. Yeah, the second one here is related to the fourth and to the sixth. So by the time you get to the sixth, you can see the link back to those previous episodes in the design narrative, if you like. So that's the basic shape of them. So there are some fundamental questions as to what might an insight look like. Well, it's going to be some linkage, or reflected as some set of linkages within that graph. But it could be that it happens when all of a sudden a new area of the graph opens up and something new happens. I'll come back on this later on with some real examples, I hope. And I'm going to skip over that and go on to this. So, what are we observing? Well, he's observing the sketches that designers do, and here's an example of it, where they're sketching on a large piece of paper through their design task, and because he's observing it in real life, you can tell the time sequence with which these externalizations of the person's thinking are appearing on the sheet of paper. So somebody's drawing a particular set of planes, they've already done a little drawing on the left, this is the second drawing that they're now completing with a little perspective. Seem to be completing it there. Or is this now a new image that is being drawn? I don't know. But it appears as another event in his ethnography. Writing notes on the piece to sort of say more about what that scheme is. You can see there are other pieces of information already on the sheet of paper which are previous episodes in the design. So this is just a snippet of the kind of record that he's taking of the design process. Okay, so let's move on. So you end up with a sheet of paper on the right here, and what he's able to do from the video is to go in and to code then a series of design episodes as pieces of work and then how those relate to each other. And quite often you'll find that people will do something here, they'll go and work over there, and then they'll come back on and do more over here once they've thought something through. Or they do something here and then reproduce it somewhere else in a slightly different form and have a second go at it. And that allows you to infer whether people are making backward links to previously done parts of the design process. It allows you then to subdivide the whole set of pieces of graphic, if you like, on the sheet of paper, construct effectively the Linkograph. You can see it now appearing on the sheet. Different situations in the same sort of way, so somebody's had some ideas here about nature and trees, and they appear over here. Well, there's a virtual link in there, in spite of the fact that time went in this direction. There's a tree here, but it's referring back to one there. So that's an actual Linkograph for a whole design process, and you can see there's some structure in this. There's some interesting things. There are things that happen here, which then reassert themselves right down here close to the end. There are areas where there's a complete gap in process. It appears that there's no relationships between what's gone previously here to anything back there, except for these ones that then refer right back to the beginning. So that's a particularly interesting episode. But other areas of this are much more heavily interlinked. So what's going on in these early stages are a whole series of things which then incrementally change as they explore their way through a design process. It could be that this is a eureka moment, I suspect. We shall find out. So a representation now of two different cases, case 1, case 2, in which you can see some chunking into chunks of the design process. A set of things here, another set of things in the middle that are all relatively connected, another set there that are relatively connected, versus one here where there's much longer scale connections taking place across time. Certain bits are densely connected in this early phase, and then these subdivided and separated off sections which only make sort of a single or a few big links back in the later phase of the design. Now, one of the things you can then do is to look at the shape of those design processes in either directed or undirected ways. So what was the directed version of this? At stage 2, well, you only got stage 1 above you. At stage 3, you got 1 and 2, etc. So you can look at this as it grows over time through a process. And that's in the directed view of the Linkograph. In this version, it's the undirected view. And so there's something here which says the shape of the change of the graph from different points of view in the design process, considering backward links and forward links, as though you had perfect foresight. And this is how it then actually grew in time. So those two versions allow one to construct an analysis of these different parts of the graph from those two different points of view. Where there was a sudden insight in case study 2, that place where there was a big link, of course, in the growing of the graph from nothing, there's a complete gap here and a separate 1 and 2 starting there, and then it links back. And the point it links back, then you've got the whole thing coming together into a single final graph. You can also see that these sudden insights, when they are separated, those are separated elements in that whole undirected version of the graph as well. Now, that then lets him take some various measures of the graph, and for example, you can take measures of closeness, measures of betweenness, and in fact he's taking also measures of entropy to look at what is the state of the graph at different stages through the design process. And there are various things here, so sudden insights appear to happen as fluctuations in a whole series of measures on the way through. Similar sorts of things happen here. So this is relatively incremental change taking place here, and the graph is relatively constant. Major fluctuations taking place in that zone there. And this is what he's saying is isolating the sudden insight, the eureka moment. You can then look at the correlation between the directed and undirected measures. The idea here is that if you have a look at the nature of sudden insights, they will appear as a lack of correlation between directed and undirected. I think the key part of the whole of this approach is trying to come to a well-formulated ethnography, if you like, of design processes. So there's a very important stage in this work was actually understanding what a design episode is as it is externalized onto the drawing, and becoming quite precise about the definition of the episode. In the previous work that people have done on linkographs, this has always remained relative. These have been used by a number of other people working on design processes, but that episode definition is rather poorly defined by and large. Either people treat every single line stroke on the drawing as a separate episode, in which case it's all pretty boring, or they seem to have no proper definition as to what a design episode is. I think that what Temo has done is to work very carefully with his qualitative analysis to be able to identify precise episodes as they are externalized on the sheet of paper. And they tend to be sketching specific figural things that you can see that make sense as an entity on the drawing on the piece of paper. Okay, so two types of transformation of ideas, what he's calling a vertical transformation and a lateral transformation. Where you have vertical transformations going on, he's saying this is leading to convergent thinking, and these tend to be the links back across space or across the space of the linkograph. You have lateral translations, those are incremental changes taking place which appear to be divergent thinking. It's where you branch off into different things steadily as you go through from episode to episode. There seem to be phenomena that you can show within the structure of the graph itself. And finally, the important contributions that he's got here, ability to capture the different stages of the design, as I was saying, giving rise to the possibility of better understanding of conditions in which creativity and innovation take place, giving some accuracy to quantifying the multi-level graph as it's guaranteed jointly using syntax and time-coded measures. And then this idea that you have justified graphs allowing you to describe the structure of the network in both the directed and the undirected forms. Finally, the following things are involved or illustrated by the linkograph, and that's the connectivities of the design process, if you like, integration of vertices in the structure of the networks, set of issues to do actually with identifying these drastic changes. I think the basic forms, just to simplify it, things that are quite separate, things that are bridged and linked, and then there are things that sort of overlap quite a lot. Yeah? You can think about this as in differing natures of the bridging nodes. You can have a whole lot of episodes that give rise to a particular view that then just goes on to one state in the future, a whole lot that then link forward a whole lot, so they're quite central, important conceptual pieces of work that draw a lot of things together. Things that just come from a specific idea previously, which then give rise to multiple impacts in the future design process. And then these bright ideas, which tend to be a gap in the process, something new has come into the head that appears not to have any predecessor, but which then gives rise to a whole lot of stuff afterwards. And on occasion, those, of course, are bridged across because you do, in future episodes, then make reference to previous episodes and draw things together, and you're synthesizing stuff. Advantages of directed linkograph are very advantageous. So, a quote to end. Design is an opportunity to continue telling the story, not just to sum everything up, by Tate Linden. And this is my contribution to this presentation. I thought, who is Tate Linden? And I hadn't got a clue. So I looked him up, and he turns out to be this person. So there you are, thank you.
I'm curious there seems to me to this, I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff on the design episode thing. I think is really, really interesting. But what I'm curious about it is whether there's a sort of almost with the risk of being too harsh, a bit of a romantic designer view that overlaying the entire project. If I put it bluntly, how does he make sure that it's an aha moment and not an oh shit moment that leads to drastic changes?
I think I don't know what his answer would be. I think my answer to that would be that the oh shit moment is just as important as the aha moment in design.
Yeah, I think so as well, but I think it's important when we start to interpret this result to either acknowledge that this is the case, or to, I'm not sure.
That's a good question. I think that's a good question, and the question would be, could he detect the difference between those two in any form in the Linkograph? I mean, I suspect he will see them like that on the sheet of paper. That could be quite easy gestural.
But in the Linkograph with the gap and the light bulb going on moment, that could equally be represented as the aha or the oh shit moment. But in a way, if what moves on from that is equally as productive, conducive, does it really matter what the nature of that light bulb moment is?
It absolutely matters on a design theory level, not possibly on a social sort of or process level, but on a design theory level. It absolutely matters if you consider design to consist of episodes of positive creative insights, or if you consider it as an interplay between sort of failures and ideas in a way. And that's really important.
But I mean, if you imagine the theoretical example where someone was going through a sequence of episodes, and then had this schism, this break with a sudden insight, and then what went on, imagine two versions of this, one where the insight was a true aha moment, and the other where the insight was an oh shit moment. If everything else that led on was identical, and I can claim they would be identical because this is my theoretical example, does it actually matter?
Yes, it does matter for our understanding of what kind of process the design process is, and if it consists of a continuous stream of good ideas that we get better and better and better ideas, or if it's a process of also testing and developing these ideas to a certain point where we make the evaluation whether they are good or bad. And if we only consider it as aha moments, we do not allow this process of evaluating ideas to get properly into the design process. And then I think we're misunderstanding it.
I mean, I think if there's to be a critique of this, there's a whole lot of stuff that this is limited to being able to observe those things that the person chooses to externalise onto the sheet of paper. There's a whole lot of other stuff that they could have drawn that they may be discounting in their head without even putting it onto the sheet. Yeah, there are clearly those things where you start to draw things and realise actually that the idea in your head just doesn't work for some reason. And that's maybe an oh shit moment because you were greatly wedded to this idea that was in your head. And I think it's an interesting question for him, it's a challenge for him to see whether or not he could identify that kind of episode and if it has any particular characteristics. I think it's a very useful suggestion. I think the part that's more difficult is the part that about what are those ideas that are in your head, that you've done the calculations, if you like, in your head before you've even drawn and you've discounted, or that you...
I think so as well, but I think I mean, we could talk about many different people here. We could, for instance, refer to Sanford Anderson and his idea of externalizing as a way of trying out and testing and evaluating that process. So you actually don't only draw your good ideas, you draw also the ideas you're unsure about, and to explore and find out, try out. That's the point where they might fail, when they actually become externalized, because there are things that you can think work, but when you test them in a slightly more an attempt of realizing them as a plan or a picture or whatever, that's when you see whether they work or not. And that's the kind of moment I think needs to get in as an ideal of what the process is.
Yes, agree? Sure.
Well, I was just going to say that it's conceivable that the difference between the aha and the oh shit moment would be characterized by more backlinks fairly soon after that happens. If it's oh shit moment, you're starting from scratch. It'll take you a while before you make any connections to what you did before, where it's aha, you probably actually draw in things that have recently happened in the design. But Ruth's example, I mean, that was just the point, but Ruth's example, saying everything else the same afterwards, I can see that might not be the case. What I wonder is, and this may be a good way of asking your original question, is the problem with the gap. I mean, the gap is a potentially evidence of something having gone on there, aha or oh shit, but isn't what we're really interested in what's happened in the gap. I mean, is the gap just avoiding the question by saying there's nothing happening there, and isn't the phenomenon actually...
Yeah, I mean,
what's actually gone in?
It's another way of formulating the question, that's saying that the radical changes can have many different reasons, and we shouldn't assume that they are positive creative insights. They can also be frustrations, they can be many different things, and we should allow this to get into the thinking, because otherwise we are idealizing a process, we are doing the thing that I thought postmodernist told us not to do, idealizing the architect as a genius, brilliant person who continuously just makes better and better ideas. And I don't think we should do that, because this has so much more potential when that's sort of slight. I'm not saying he's doing that exactly, but that's exaggerating what's going on. So
I believe this is actually implicit in the whole Linkograph notion, actually. And I suspect that because it sort of comes from a mechanical engineering view of design, where the whole world is, you have a decent brief at the beginning, I need an implement to extract a cork from a bottle, yes, and you know how big a bottle is, you know how big a cork is, you know the coefficient of friction, and you know the principles of engineering, you can engineer your way to a solution. Architecture is not like that. And I think that the point about this is that very often in architectural design, the aha moment is when you understand what the question is. And it's late on in the design process, all of a sudden, this is what this is all about. Or maybe it's oh shit, this is what it's all about. But that's the distinction in the architectural version. Now, I think that's actually maybe an interesting thing here about looking at this as a directed and an undirected graph. The notion of it being undirected is an odd idea. Yeah? Everybody would think of these things as being clearly a design process that's a directed process. But the notion of the undirected version of it is that there is actually some reality that what you're reflecting on in the final stages allows you to re-evaluate all the positions at the beginning of the process, and that, in a sense, the things that you're doing at the beginning of the process foresee the potential of all of those possible things that you might have been doing at the end. And I think that's something quite architectural in its nature.
I wonder if something that Tower actually dropped. Originally, it had lots of different types of graphs for lots of different types of representations, and they've all been combined into one right now. But as you say, the important thing is the difference between the undirected and directed.
I think that's what he's contributing with it.
But there's also, I mean, one of the you said you would explain had a picture of Kussler's transition of matrices. It was up in the corner among a lot of cartoons and things.
Yeah.
But the point about that is that that one, just after that, the point about that is that you go from one method of representation to another. It's only by shifting from one representation to another do you actually make that connection from what you had before to afterwards. So in that there's a big difference between the directed and the undirected of those particular moments. I wonder if the same sort of thing might occur if you look at all of the individual graphs that you have of different representations, of different ways of looking at the process, and if the eureka moment might also be something that you would see as a big difference between those types of graphs.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the cursor thing here is referring to his ethnography more than anything else. So it's recognising that in externalising things onto the sheet of paper, that you then turn the sheet of paper over from time to time and look at it in a different way, or try and completely move from doing a plan to doing a section in order to explore some other thing. And it's that change of representation that he captures as an episode in his graph. I think actually it's an interesting idea to explore those parts of the of what's gone into his ethnography, but actually try to extract that back into the graph. Yeah. Any more? Half past. Okay, thank you very much.